I have a couple of sayings about security. One is in threat analysis, there's really very little revolution. It's oftentimes evolution. You see incremental changes over time. So long as you're tracking the threats and the activities that are taking place, you're probably not going to get too many surprises. There might be one or two here and there, but for the most part, new technical evolutions in the threats and the attack activities are really incremental steps.
All right, Stan, so we talk a lot about IoT-based malware on these embedded devices, and there's a story that came out. We've talked about Hajime a little bit, and this is a story specifically about Mirai and Hajime, and I was wondering if you could tee it up for us, maybe, talk about it.
Well, it's a little bit old. It's about a month or so old, but I thought it was interesting because it's comparing, like you said, Mirai and Hajime. It's an article at ThreatPost, and basically, they're just doing a comparison about like this big IoT battle that's coming, where Mirai is trying to take over devices, Hajime is trying to take over devices, and the way it works, if you restart the device, then the virus gets lost. And so they see this epic battle happening eventually, where they try to one-up each other.
You have this kind of situation where you have different families of malware vying for ownership of these devices.
It's the usual problem with IoT devices. They're so vulnerable. They're in such a vulnerable state out there. And I think a lot of people who own these devices, they don't really know that, hey, this device could even have a problem. And then they actually discuss some things about, like, the good and bad of potentially doing the Hajime capability. So let me talk about what that means. Mirai, everybody knows because it's responsible for DDoS attacks. So that's the capability of Mirai. And then Hajime doesn't seem to have a capability. The only thing that has been reported is that it displays this message on the screen that, hey, I'm a white hat and I'm just doing my thing, trying to take care of the internet or something like that.
Anybody who goes into somebody else's device without permission, it's technically not legal. So while their intent may be, have good intentions, it's technically not the best way to do it.
So the idea is there's all these IoT devices with 23 open, right, port 23, and there's like a grab for them. The Hajime good guy gets it, tries to sort of lock it down, or Mirai gets it and tries to use it for DDoSes, right? I mean, that's kind of the struggle.
But there's not just those two, because Stan and I know there's several other, maybe smaller, some are pretty larger botnets that are using different families of malware. Luabot is one that we know about. There's some other families of malware out there as well that all vie for it. And when the device gets rebooted, now it's somebody else's turn to get in there. And it's like a race to see who can get it first.
Yeah. One thing we did notice with Luabot, it does have, it's separate from the story, but it does have that Mirai killing capability as well.
Oh, it can override it?
It tries to like close down the process and things like that. And then it tries to patch the vulnerability that it came in on, so nobody else can take the device over and things like that. So that's Luabot. But like John said, there's so many of these things now, and they're all fighting for these resources, and they're all trying to take the other offline.
It's really a new world, There's hundreds of thousands of these IoT devices or more. Now we're seeing almost a competition of these botnets in the same space, that it's kind of whoever gets to them first.
The other thing is we've seen this type of thing before. Right, so we talked about many years ago the Karna botnet that was composed of DVRs, these DVR type systems, which are not exactly the same as these, because a lot of these IoT devices are more like routers. I guess they're still doing it. Hajime might be taking over some of the other types of devices as well. But anyway, so there's Karna, and Reincarna was like another respin of Karna, both supposedly doing a similar kind of thing of this good guy trying to lock down the device before somebody else bad or worse gets in there.
Well, were those peer-to-peer too? Because I think it said Hajime is using peer-to-peer, where Mirai uses regular command and control.
Right, it uses a centralized command and control from Mirai. So Hajime uses peer-to-peer. Karna and Reincarna did, I believe, right?
They were, both
peer-to-peer, which is that's more of an advanced type of strategy for command and control, a little bit more difficult to implement from a code perspective. But another interesting aspect of it is once the device is compromised, it does open a port on the device that's, I guess, somewhat randomized. It's not always the same port. And if you know what that port is and you connect to it, it'll actually deliver you a copy of the malware. So, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's
That's
using
part of its,
the peering network there to basically distribute the malware.
Right.
So the distribution is also distributed.
distributed. Right. It's interesting family of malware, but again, I don't consider it the right. The problem is there's no really good strategy. We've talked about this a lot over the past couple of years. The right thing to do is for people to take action and secure their own devices, make sure they're patched, make sure they don't have default passwords and all that stuff. But it's kind of hard to tell a million different people to do that, and you're never going to be able to do that.
I think also people don't really know that they have this problem.
Right.
You know, like
and they might not know whether they should even care. Like some people just don't even realize that what impact this might have to them ultimately.
Exactly. And so I think that's where the problem comes in. And that's why some of these white hats are probably deciding to take, things into their own hands.
It's just crazy that there's so many of these IoT devices out there that now we're seeing sort of a battle scene of who can get a hold of them first. It's definitely
I
the
think
sign
it all
of the
started
times.
with the Karna. Really, the guy opened up his research and he put out his findings out there. So it allowed everybody else to kind of say, oh, yeah, this is a problem. And maybe I should do something. And some people said, I'm going to monetize this in a negative way. And some people are now trying to respond to that.
Right.
Something I wouldn't do, but...
Interesting story. I guess we'll just keep on track of this trend. I don't see it abating anytime soon. So it's just probably going to get crazier.
It's definitely a situation that I don't think very many people would have predicted a few years ago. So the folks at GuardiCore put out a post about a botnet called Bondnet. It's basically a James Bond motif botnet out there. Very internet thing where it's Bondnet. It's 007 is within the command and control. So we're always seeing new kind of quirky things with these botnets, and this is one it's the James Bond of botnets.
So all of these devices, they're being used to, they're being taken over for mining digital currency. So I think Monero is the one that was mentioned here.
It's getting at over 15,000 machines. It's almost like a blast from the past because it's servers, it's Windows, it's not another one of these IoT
Yeah, we talk
devices.
so much about IoT-based botnets lately. It's kind of refreshing to see a Windows-based one. Not saying I want to see more Windows-based botnets, but
It's interesting you mentioned the servers and things like that. Do we know how it's spreading?
Yeah, so it's using a few different vulnerabilities, primarily my PHP admin port. Is that?
So if the server's got the PHPMyAdmin open.
But then that was the initial vector, but then, as it's evolved, it's now got a number of different vectors. So they have a chart here where it's primarily, a lot of it's going over MySQL. It uses JBoss vulnerabilities, Tomcat. So it's using a number of different.
Elasticsearch.
Yeah. So
a bunch of SQL Server type things, but also some web front end engine things like JBoss and Tomcat, WebLogic.
Right, but it is pretty Struts, yeah.
Struts too. So there was that exploit. I'm sure we covered on the story on the show about struts. So that's another interesting one.
It's interesting because it doesn't have to be. With some of those vulnerabilities, they would run on a Linux system. It sounds like whoever this is that wrote it, though, is familiar with Windows.
Right.
So they created the virus or the botnet for that. Okay.
Yeah, I wonder what happens when they hit a JBoss or Tomcat server under Linux if they just say, not interested.
Yeah.
Or perhaps there's another version of this that's for those other operating systems. I guess maybe it's something to look into.
Yeah. So, but yeah, interesting write-up. They actually even publish a detection and cleanup tool. They publish some indicators of compromise that you can use. There's even this pretty useful flow chart that shows how the hackers do recon and then push out the exploit and then download malware and then end up, through the victim starting to mine the currency.
I was really impressed with this write-up. I thought it was really well organized and researched pretty thoroughly. Especially they give you a lot of indicators to follow up on with command and controls, attacker IPs, things of that nature. So it could help any researchers out there that want to follow or track this botnet have some ability to do so. So, or even to defend against it for the general purpose person. So, really interesting write-up.
Yeah, one thing I noticed you mentioned is a blast from the past.
Yeah.
And just all these vulnerabilities make me think of maybe like 15, 20 years ago, where a lot of spreading of malware was by exploiting servers and vulnerabilities in them. And then over some period of time, people started putting better firewalls in place. And so these vulnerabilities started kind of disappearing. And then the next way to infect machines was by impacting, that phishing came up as a big threat, right?
Right.
Because you were like, oh, let's get on the laptop. And that's how a lot of people are getting infected. But it sounds like we're going back to that time, even with the IoT devices, where you're just like scanning and infecting devices.
And using any vector you can find, rather than used to be, I have one vulnerability, one attack vector, I use that. Now I can, do my recon and then push out against, dozens of
multiple
vectors.
types of exploit vectors, right?
Right, so.
It'll be interesting also to see if they switch off of doing just cryptocurrency mining to do more things with it. But it also is interesting that they're using Windows machines for mining because they're probably more powerful, right? So you'd be able to get more bang for your buck than you would with these embedded IoT devices, which are pretty low-powered devices.
Yeah.
Have good patching processes. If you're using web hosting providers, make sure that they have good patching processes. So a lot of these are cloud computing devices. I would suspect that depending on who your cloud provider is, they may or may not apply patches to your device for you, especially if you're installing additional software on the top beyond what they install in their base installation. So you got to pay attention to what's running on your system.
It's kind of a flashback to the past. Traditional exploits, going after traditional type operating systems and trying to build a sort of a traditional botnet.
We did cover a story a few weeks back about this increase on 81 TCP scanning, which looked like it came from a bunch of IoT bots. And now, hindsight, we can kind of tell some other researchers have discovered there's another botnet family of malware out there. All right, let's take a look at the internet weather for the week. And actually, this was, normally we don't have a whole lot of different things to talk about. This one was a little bit interesting because there is some changes in some things, notably with a particular botnet that is reactivated. So we'll talk about it a little bit.
Change is good for the program, but not necessarily good for tracking threats.
Yeah, it's good for us to have something to talk about, but not good for the internet in general. In any event, let's just take a quick look here. The most probe ports, this is where we see most of the scanning activity, not based on how many devices are scanning, but just sheer volume of traffic. No surprises here. Telnet, 23 TCP, SSH. This 7547 is that CPE WAN management protocol, mostly associated with Mirai bots scanning for that, and then FTP. One of the things about FTP, it has been kind of flopping in and up on the top 10. It's kind of sunk down into the 20 and then into the 10 week to week. And there is something that Stan and I had been looking at. There's a botnet that's going around and it's looking for FTP servers that have anonymous access open, and they're putting malware up there.
I'm dating myself because it's before things like Box and tools where you had a place to drop files, people would put an anonymous FTP server out there, and the next thing you know, somebody discovers it's there and your files are showing up in some other place. Or so perhaps a sort of an old school mindset, but I think there's still things like that going on out there.
Right, there are, and there is a particular actor, like I said, that's a little interesting what they're doing. So maybe I'll save that for maybe the next show.
And that's recent, right? That FTP-based botnet's recent activity, or it's been going on
that
for a while?
is, I can't say it's all attributed, all of this that we're seeing here is attributed to that one actor, but it is somebody who's using and scanning for a lot of FTP servers. So this is the most sources probing, which is usually indicative of some kind of botnet activity because you got a lot of sources at once doing it. The things I would point out here is 445 TCP jumped up a little bit. The other interesting ones, which I didn't highlight 81 TCP, but we're going to take a closer look at that. And 82 TCP went up 182 spots, which is obviously a big change.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a closer look at that in a chart here and what that's all about.
Well, you and I were on doing the weather a few weeks ago when we first started to see that 81.
Yes.
So it'll be interesting
and we
to
have
see.
some more answers since that time. That was probably like 3 weeks or so ago, I think. And we weren't quite sure because it just started at that point.
Right.
But now we have a little bit more information.
Cool. A few weeks ago when I was on, we found a new scan probe on port 81 TCP. We had sort of assumed that something was going to come out. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, here we are.
So this is kind of a real kind of busy chart, but I wanted to get all this together. So when we had first looked at this on the program, it was probably like right around here.
Yeah.
And so maybe...
That's back in April.
Yeah, it was back in April,
then
like late
right?
April.
Yeah.
And we weren't really sure what it was, but we could tell that it was a lot of IoT devices. A lot of them had a web server running on port 81 as well. So we're figuring that's probably what they're exploiting. And lo and behold, that's really what was happening.
I think it's important to kind of point out that it's really hard to see activity and then really make an immediate connection to really what the cause is. On one hand, it's really good to see the indicators, have the opportunity to go in and find out more about it, maybe trigger some activity in the industry, but it really takes a little bit more than just analyzing activity on the network to be able to understand exactly what's going on.
So there's a family of malware that some other people researched, and I have another page on it in a few moments, a pretty good write-up that someone did. It's called Mirai, which is kind of a twist on the word Mirai and Persian. So it's Persian Mirai,
Right.
because they're actually using command and controls that end in .ir for Iran. You know, they were able to determine that that's what this botnet is. It's exploiting a vulnerability in a family of IP cameras that listen on port 81, and they're able to leverage and exploit there. I think you were looking at
Yeah,
it a little bit.
they're kind of taking advantage of the universal plug and play port, so they can use the vulnerability on the UPnP and then use that to go out and get the malware and start controlling
to
the,
open a port or to tell the
Exactly,
device
yep.
to go get it. Okay.
So
So somewhere right around the 26th of April, all this activity just ceased, all the scanning activity. And we did notice that these command and controls were parked to these IP addresses. Now, I didn't know at the time if this was like some researcher or some good guy said, let's sinkhole these things to someplace, or if it was the bad guy. Now I'm starting to think it's probably the bad guy just temporarily parked his domains. And that's what he did. He parked it to these 10 dot addresses
Lay
for
low.
a period of time.
Yeah, it's just out of curiosity, is there something that drew attention back here that they would have been motivated to kind of...
I did not try to align when the stories came out. We actually, it might be
ThreatTraq.
on the... Yeah, it's right. They saw the show and they got all panicked. I don't think that's the case. It might be some other people that published some articles, because there are some good articles out there, and maybe they said, well, let's lay low for a little bit before we start up again.
And this is not particularly unusual for somebody to do that. We've seen botnets.
Yes,
It
this
was
is
actually a
pretty
very
normal.
very frequent occurrence in the past. And when I say in the past, I'm talking about IRC botnets
Right.
and
7
activity
years
well
or so ago.
prior to the IoT botnets that we're observing today. It was mostly Windows machines back then,
Right.
before automatic updates and things like that. So
Right.
yeah.
So they did, and we have pretty good precision on this with our passive DNS. So we could see, like, literally the same hour that they reactivated a new IP address, boom, all the scanning activity started up again. It did trickle off, and then they switched to a new IP, and this is where it currently is, that 123.58.5.179 IP. Still the same domain names, so it's not anything otherwise, from a C2 perspective new. The thing that is interesting that's shown on here is this is a mixed chart of both 81 and 82 TCP scanning. And you'll see that the blue on the 15th there, 14th it looks like, May 14th, they started scanning 82 TCP, and that's why it jumped up so high as it did here.
switched.
And they literally switched midstream back to 81, and you can actually see literally all the bots stopped and started doing the other port. So when I actually collected all these IPs together, and then I check against our reconnaissance index, which kind of shows you this IP, what ports is it scanning, they are scanning 81, 82, 23, and 7547, which is interesting because in addition to the 81 and 82, they're scanning the same two ports that Mirai is kind of notorious for scanning. So it's a little interesting.
So it shows you it's sort of a variant of Mirai. They're probably using some of the same.
The researchers seem to think that there's enough of a change in the code base there that makes it not the same author. But I haven't analyzed it myself, to be honest with you.
So the port 82, do you have an idea what
I
they're
don't
going after there?
know
Or maybe
if
it was a
it's-
mistake or just checking something?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I don't know. I didn't get a chance to research it thoroughly. I'm going to guess there's probably some other devices of a similar nature listening on that port? 'Cause
There's a
that's-
possibility that, some applications, they'll see if a particular port's available, and if it's not available, they'll go to the next port. We saw that with VNC, for example, does that.
Right.
And so there's a possibility that this application, it says, oh, well, if port 81's not available to me, I'll
Yeah, there
offer
might
this
be-
up on port 82 or something
Right.
like that. Is that part of universal plug and play? It might have something along those lines.
I don't remember seeing it in the
Okay.
the stuff that I saw,
But anyway, that's just a theory that might.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's still more probably study that needs to be done on this, but I thought it was interesting. It's definitely looking at the scan sources, same botnet scanning these 2 ports, in addition to some of the telnet.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that timing there.
Right.
It's at least very strong circumstantial evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But when you have the same addresses doing it as well, it's
Yes,
pretty.
yeah, I checked those all out. This is the actual write-up. So I think it's the NetLab 360 blog or 360 NetLab blog. They actually, I don't know much about them, but they did a really good write-up on this. So I'd reference people to take a look at it. It's very thorough, goes into a lot of detail about this family of malware. It's a little bit older. So they did it on the 24th is when this was released. So yeah, the 24th would have been kind of right in this spot here. And then 2 days later is when it went away temporarily. So I don't know if there's any is there any correlation necessarily with that, but thought it was interesting. So I would
Probably
recommend
had a
people
buddy,
take a
hey,
read.
somebody found your botnet.
Yeah.
Yeah, who knows?
It appears that in that particular case, that information got into the public domain about the botnet. It looked like the operator didn't want that attention, kind of shut it off for a while, laid low. We've seen that kind of activity in the past. In fact, it used to be quite common where botnets would get discovered, the operator would lay low, maybe move their resources over to a different botnet so it wouldn't show up so much. And eventually you'd see that botnet come back to life and do some things. And that's exactly what showed up this past week.
This guy, the 360 Network Security Research Lab, they were calling it the 81 TCP botnet. But I think another organization came out with Mirai, which has probably caught on a little bit more. Because it has a little bit more of a...
Stands out a little
yeah,
better.
stands out a little bit better. I thought this was interesting. We're talking about the overlap of the scan sources. So this is a picture of the scan sources on 82 TCP, and I actually overlaid the 81 TCP. There is an interesting thing that we could toggle between the two. As you'll see over here in Asia, there are 81 TCPs scanning, but not in 82 TCP. So I thought that was a little interesting that you could toggle it. And there's a little bit of variation in Europe. But when you look at the U.S. and South America, it's almost exactly the same.
It's pretty good
There's
density
not, there's not a lot of change. I thought that was an interesting kind of flip chart there, that you could see that the populations were pretty roughly the same. And in my analysis, it showed that it's the exact same IPs, in large part, except for some of these little small groupings in other countries, which I can't explain.
Yeah, just as a sort of a side note here, that kind of analysis, I'm not sure to what extent it's actually been done, but saying, looking at what addresses are doing and relating it to other activity that we see and, sort of doing a correlation analysis of that would be kind of a cool thing to automate and see, you picked up on this one because you were looking at it, but
Right. There
some
might be
other
others.
activities are a little harder to find the correlation
Right.
without having some automation behind it. So
Right.
Well, and those scan probes kind of make these things jump out at us, right? That we see.
the events stick out, but the
Yeah.
correlation between the events is a little. You have to have a way to find that.
Right.
Right. I think that might be, that's the end of the weather for this week. But I thought it was a little interesting, some of the stuff with the Mirai there, that we had some visibility into the starting and stopping of that activity,
Yeah, we
and the
see sort of
overlap
a-
between the 2 ports.
The circle of it, circle of life.
Right.
Yeah.
The circle of life of botnets.
Looking back in time, if you don't remember your history, it's inevitable. It's going to repeat. You're going to end up repeating it, and it's true on the internet as well.